Sukiyaki Western Django movie review. This is an interesting one. I'm not sure this movie entirely succeeds, but at the very least, you've got to give it credit for being ambitious and trying something new. This is a 2007 Japanese movie. And Sukiyaki Western here is a take on the spaghetti Western. So Sukiyaki being like a Japanese noodle dish, so instead of a spaghetti Western, it's Sukiyaki Western. Django, obviously that Tarantino film is going to come to mind, but this came out all the way back in 2007. So according to Wikipedia, this is a reference to a famous Italian spaghetti Western by the name of Django, which might also be where the Tarantino film comes from. I don't know. A small digression here, but there actually is a long history of Japanese fascination with Westerns. Westerns were amazingly popular in Japan, and apparently there was even a period where some Westerns were being produced inside of Japan. I read some guy's website about it once, about, all these Japanese cowboy movies. That was way back in the day. This is more recent, 2007, so it's the only recent Japanese Western movie that I know of. So when you think of a movie like this, especially the name, but just any kind of movie that references old classic film cinema or schlock cinema, Quentin Tarantino comes to mind. This seems like the type of movie Quentin Tarantino would love himself, and surprisingly enough, in an act of international casting, they actually got him on this movie. I don't think he had anything to do with writing or producing it, but they got him to cameo as an actor. He appears briefly at the beginning and again at the end to kind of frame the story. So the film is a retelling of the famous battle between the Minamoto and Taira clans in Japan, which I'm going to be honest, I don't know anything about. I mean, I'm a history buff, but I don't know anything about this particular era of history. But I think it's a really big deal in Japanese history. It was the inspiration for Tales of the Heike, which is a huge Japanese classic, epic classic about this clash between these two clans. So they're doing this, but they're doing it as a Western. So it's a same story. It's the same story apparently as this classic Japanese epic, but they just made everyone cowboys instead. Which that in itself would probably have been enough, but then for whatever reason they decide to add another layer on this. So apparently this battle between two Japanese clans is similar to the War of the Roses. And at one point, the characters in the movie actually start making comparisons between their own situation and the War of the Roses. And it becomes something they frequently comment on, to the point where the leader of one of the clans even changes his name to Henry, from Shakespeare's Henry VI, which was about the War of the Roses. And he forces out his men to act out scenes from Shakespeare's Henry VI. So obviously there are a lot of layers going on here. You've got the Tale of the Heike retold as a cowboy movie with all these allusions to Shakespeare going on. So it's, there's enough going on here to keep busy, I guess, would be the charitable way of looking at it. The uncharitable way of looking at it is they're just cramming too much stuff in here, and I don't know. It depends whether you want to be charitable or not. Now, because this is a cowboy Western, I guess to add to the feel, someone made a decision that the whole film would be shot in English. So it's a Japanese film with all Japanese actors, with the exception of Quentin Tarantino's cameo. But they're all speaking English. Now, it's very obvious that nobody is proficient as an English speaker, but, stranger things have been done in the past. There are all these stories about actors who get cast in international movies who have to learn their lines phonetically, Or there was that Memoirs of a Geisha movie, which came out a couple years previously, in which none of the casts were, most of the casts were Japanese or Chinese, not native English speakers. But that movie actually worked, and I'm guessing they got some sort of speech coach in there to really coach the actors on how to pronounce their lines. Memoirs of a Geisha, I mean. This movie, though, Sukiyaki Western Django, I don't know what speech coach they were using, but it was rubbish, whoever it was. They just cannot pronounce any of their English words and slur through the whole thing. I'm told by Wikipedia that when this was released in America, and I guess it did kind of get a limited release in the West, it was subtitled. So even though they were speaking English, somebody said, nobody's going to be able to understand this, so they subtitled it. I actually watched this in Japan. This was when I was living in Japan, so I rented the DVD from a Japanese video rental. And they did not have English subtitles, which I thought was stupid because it's a DVD, right? So why not include it? But they didn't. They just had the Japanese subtitles. I can read a little bit of Japanese, but this was a bit of a struggle. I would frequently have to pause the movie and rewind it and listen again, just to try and listen to the English that they were actually pronouncing. And keep in mind, this is me after having lived in Japan for several years. So in theory, my ear is attuned to the Japanese accent. And I should of all people be able to decode Japanese English better than your average American. But I struggled with it. So, but if you rent this movie in America, it should have English subtitles on it, so no problem there. The humor in this movie, and it is primarily a satire, so it's done for humor. The humor in the movie is, I don't know, wasn't really my thing mostly. Some of it worked. It is a satire, and they're satirizing different genres, and Shakespeare is thrown in there, as I was mentioning before. But much of the humor in here is really just lowbrow, and the movie feels like it's just a little bit too smug for its own good. Like it feels like the movie thinks it's just a little bit cuter than it is. I think where this movie went wrong is the art to doing comedy, or at least the art especially to doing satire, is to play it straight. Like have the comedy come through from the situation, but don't have like the actors mugging it up as if they know it's a big joke. I don't know. That's one way to do comedy, at least. That's not the way this film works. They're really mugging it up and kind of almost winking at the camera the whole time. And much of the humor seems to be based on the fact that they know that they're mangling the English language. So it's just, I guess the humor is supposed to be you're watching a bunch of Japanese actors slur their way through 2 hours of cowboy dialogue. And Shakespeare. And they're also mangling Shakespeare. And that is funny to an extent, but it's not 2 hours funny. Like, watching this whole movie was a little bit of a slog. By the way, according to Wikipedia, the American version of this movie was cut down. So, this is another case where yet I find my attention span is more in line with Americans than with Japanese. I could quite happily have gone for a shorter version of this movie, the one that got released in America. Another large part of the humor in this movie is just people dying in funny ways, or having funny expressions on their faces, or making funny twitches when they die. And again, this comes a little bit back to what I was saying before about them mugging for the camera a lot. I think I haven't seen a lot of Japanese cinema, but the Japanese cinema I have seen, especially the newer type comedies, this type of humor tends to come up a lot. Seems like it's coming up a lot. I'm not a big fan, but maybe that's just a personal preference. I've also picked up via the internet that apparently there are a lot of references to spaghetti westerns in this movie, and specifically the film Django, not the Tarantino film, but the Italian spaghetti western. And perhaps I didn't pick up on everything because I wasn't well versed in spaghetti western cinema. It's possible some stuff went over my head. But on the other hand, there are some references that are so obvious you can't miss them. Like they couldn't go over my head. For example, when the new gunman in town is trying to decide which clan he's going to join, someone shouts out at him not to get any ideas about Yojimbo. And I thought, okay, I got that reference. I mean, how could you miss it, right? It's a reference to Yojimbo. There's another part when Quentin Tarantino is explaining to someone why he named his son Akira. And he says, well, what can I say? At the end, I am just an anime otaku. And I thought, okay, I got that. That's a reference to the Akira anime movie. Again, pretty much impossible to miss, and pretty artless meta-referencing. I mean, like there's supposed to be an art to how you subtly meta-reference other movies within your movie, or I don't know. I just thought it was so on the nose that it was just like, a groaner. I thought, okay, you gotta hide the references a little bit here. So, yeah, I guess in the end, I'm gonna have to say this film largely did not work for me. But, it was interesting. They were trying to do something different. You hate to be hard on a film that's trying something new, don't you? I don't know, maybe go check it out, but keep your expectations low.